So last week was Teacher Appreciation Week, and today is Mother's Day. And I'm going to do the intersection of the two and talk about my grandma Campbell, who was my father's mother. She was a school teacher, and she was she started being a school teacher when my father was a teenager. So why am I featuring my grandma, who, as I said, was a school teacher? Now, she wasn't my teacher officially. I learned a lot from her, of course, but what I want to talk about is a huge lesson I learned from her, which was what education means and what education can do. So early on in my life, I grew up in Georgia. I've talked about various places I lived. I lived in a lot of places as a child. And for the first 11, 12 years of my life, I lived in Georgia. And Grandma and Granddaddy, which we can see in this picture here, lived in Marion, South Carolina, which is near Florence, South Carolina. And you probably don't know where either of them are unless you live in South Carolina yourself. My mom used to drop me off at Grandma Campbell's. She was close, and I'd be there for a week. The thing is, of course, school in Georgia was not necessarily correlated with school in South Carolina. And my grandma was a teacher. As I said, she started when my dad was a teenager, and she was told, I think, by the principal that if she wanted to be more than an aide for kindergarten, she'd have to get a college degree. So my grandma was going through college the same time my dad was going through college. Now, they didn't go to the same college. My dad was at Clemson University studying to be an engineer, and so my mom was studying nursing at Clemson as well. That's its own story. My grandma went to Francis Marion College, which was, of course, near Marion, South Carolina. It's now Francis Marion University, and my cousins went there. My grandma was attending classes with some of my dad's high school classmates so that she could get the degree, so that she could be a full-time teacher as a public school teacher in Marion. And she was. When I was, the first time I remember that she took me to her classroom, I think I was 5 or 6 years old, and I had a fabulous time. This picture, I'm like about 4 years old, 3 or 4 years old. But I'm 5 years old, had a great time. I was like a mascot for the class. My grandma taught in middle school. And, I could read since I was 3 or 4, and we were reading books. I was with her students, and we read the books together. I had been learning a little bit of Spanish in kindergarten or first grade, and I was doing the names of the colors in Spanish, rojo and azul and amarillo. And it was awesome. We were having a great time. And I didn't think, because again, I'm like 5 years old. I have no idea. We're all doing stuff together. It's great. But I didn't think at the time that my grandma's students were reading the same level I was. So it wasn't until a few years later, like when I was about 9 or 10 years old, and this happened, that I realized what Grandma was. And Grandma was a special education teacher. As I said, so my first time I was there, I didn't notice anything off, but as I got older, and I could read better, but her students, who were still older than me, and some of them were quite a bit older than me, they weren't the normal age for middle school students, which often happens with special education. I started to realize that they were cognitively impaired, essentially, and had been since birth. As I was getting older, I could have more conversations with Grandma about what this meant. And I talked with her. She got her degree. She's doing special education in middle school. She got her master's degree, and I do remember going to her master's ceremony when I think I was a teenager at the time. Um, and she was telling me a lot of her students back in the day would have been put in an institution and been away from their family still as minor children because they were okay. So they were called mentally retarded back then. That's not the language people use now. They're they're called developmentally disabled or cognitively impaired, cognitively disabled. Um, there's a lot of different terminology. I think some of the old terminology was more useful to get between distinctions because there's a lot of different distinctions. But the students grandma had in her class could be taught to do some simple arithmetic, could be taught to do some simple reading and writing at, I would say, a first grade level. Some of our students were like 15, 16 years old. Okay, and as I got older, of course, I was reading much more complicated stuff, and her students, and she would have students that were there multiple years in the same grade, um, didn't progress. So, what did I learn? Grandma told me, as I said, a lot of them had been institutionalized in prior systems. They would not have been educated at all. What she showed me and what I noticed looking at her students is that they understood a lot more than people assumed, that they could learn a lot more in terms of academic content than a lot of people assumed. Yes, they were still limited. I've had this argument with other people before. Oh, everyone can learn calculus. And even people of normal intelligence, no cognitive impairments as far as we can tell, calculus is not natural, and it's no ding on anybody that they don't understand calculus. That said, different people have different needs with regards to education and different things and different goals, and that's fine. If we go back to the original meaning of education, if I remember correctly, it comes from Latin, means to lead out of. So you're drawing like educe, you're taking out from people. And the thing is, her students long ago would have been considered uneducable. They could not receive any bit of benefits from education. But she and other people of her time showed that was untrue. Yes, they were still limited. As I said, they're not going to be learning Shakespeare, they're not going to be learning calculus. That's okay. However, being able to read and write and doing some simple sums is very important. And the whole point of education is to take somebody as far as they can go. So here's the main lesson from my grandma. In this picture, you see me and my grandma and my son Dermot. Dermot is cognitively impaired in certain ways, and I don't know how far he's going to be able to go. And that's the point. We don't know. Back in the day, the assumption was you couldn't teach the kinds of students my grandma had. You couldn't teach them to read or write. And yes, actually, some of them you could. I'm just going to put it out there right now. There are people who would not be able to be taught to read or write. My granddaddy worked with some of them as a volunteer when he was a retiree. Back in the day, they had the terminology educable retarded, which is, yes, they were cognitively impaired, but they could learn, to read and write and do some simple arithmetic, and it was pretty limited. And my granddaddy got some trainable retarded, which is you could teach them to do some extremely simple stuff like to sweep dirt and maybe, put clothes on. And there are people who are even more impaired than that. That's just life. But here is the point. Most institutional education, and I don't mean this as a dig, but most of it is targeted towards the big bulk in the center. And there are people who are extreme one way or the other. My son is extreme on the low end. I had been extreme on the high end in certain ways. And all of us, those of us who aren't in the big old middle, are troublesome to a certain extent. That said, the whole point of education is to help people achieve their potential to the extent they can. And you don't know how far that potential extends. That's what I learned from my grandma. Okay? A lot of the people you assumed they had more limitations than you thought, and you don't know. And what do? You try. In some cases, her students couldn't go past a certain point, but you wouldn't know until you actually tried and tried that boundary. And that's true for everybody. This is not just for those who are on the low end or those who are on the high end anywhere. A lot of times people I don't want to talk about children. So because here's another part of my grandma's story. Remember, she didn't go to college until she was like 40 years old. She didn't graduate until she was like my age, if I remember correctly. And then she did her master's, well after that. I remember her getting her master's. So she was, well older than that when she got her master's degree. And that's one of the great things about being in America. And I don't know about other countries, but my understanding is a lot of people, education, formal education ends at a certain age. You go work and that's it. But in the US, it's not that unusual. I know a lot of people, I have people I work with who are in their 30s, who are doing part-time MBAs or other degree programs. I've had it myself with regards to formal education, but I'm always learning. And that's the whole point. The whole point of education is you are leading forth. You are leading the students to be all they can be. And you don't know how much of that being they can be. My grandma died a couple years ago. And here's to you, Grandma, my big inspiration with education. My ideal as a teacher, though she was never my explicit teacher. Anyway, that's it for Teacher Appreciation Week. And I'm going to be getting to Martin Chuzzlewit next. So